FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome, and you are listening to the Financial Survival Network. It's 9/18/18, very significant day. Hey, it's the day after Constitution Day in the United States, so I guess we should all be celebrating. The Constitution has made it yet another year, and well, it's a lot abridged, a lot infringed, but it's still there, still theoretically the law of the land. Hey, as always, just send us an email. Be a part of the show, kl@kerrylutz.com. Well, Danielle Park is with us after a hiatus, largely due in part to my inability to carry dates backward and forward, but with us again, thank goodness. Danielle, welcome back.
Hey, Kerry.
So, a couple of interesting articles on your site. My favorite one here by you is How the Financial Crisis Led to Trump. And you know, on this show, on other shows, we always say everything is related. Nothing stands apart. The news media wants you to believe that every event is a separate and discrete event that has no relation to what came before and no relation to what's going to come ahead. But we know better, don't we?
Yeah, well, just as humble students and people who read books and, study other periods, you certainly see patterns. There's no question about that. And, when Brexit happened, when the Brexit vote came through, I wrote our client letter that month explaining the connection between the breakdown after in the run up to the financial crisis, the lawlessness, the breach of rule of law that the financial and corporate executives were allowed to get away with, all really was a global phenomenon. And it has led to the populist uprisings in all of these different countries. And of course, since Brexit, we've seen more of it, and indeed the Trump presidency in your own country. And it's just, it's nothing, it upsets people to think, well, if you're polarized in your political view and you see yourself as a liberal and you see yourself as a fan of Barack Obama, it's upsetting, apparently, for one to suggest that he was part of the downfall of, the key principles and tenets of your Constitution. Not, him particularly as the leader, but his administration more broadly. I would say every government really consecutively has got worse on that. And that has been this capture of political process by corporations. Mm-hmm. We've talked about it many times.
Sure.
But because they are running the governments of whatever political stripe, they're getting away with all sorts of financial abuse and crimes on every level. And the public purse continues to pick up the tab. And so that means less funds for everything that is socially important to a healthy and prosperous nation, and more engorgement of the wrong kinds of actors and actions, which is what we're dealing with today. I'm just reading Skin in the Game, Talib's next book, and I highly recommend it. But it's entirely about just this, right? The asymmetry of a system where a corporation is allowed to have all the rights and keep all the profits, but not have any of the responsibilities or costs in cleaning up the messes that they're making to extract those profits.
Totally. Well, hey, you just gave me a great idea. We should create a privatized jail for corporations where we lock up the corporations themselves so they can't continue to wreak havoc upon the country, the community, and the world. I mean,
well, it's quite simple. Like, on the one hand, corporate offenders say it wasn't me, it was the company, right? Which Talib says it's easier to bullshit macro than it is to bullshit micro, which is a fundamental concept of this, right? So in other words, if you're in a small organization where you have a handful of people directing activities, it's very difficult for them to say, well, I wasn't aware, or it wasn't me that was, the directing person behind these crimes. Right. When you're in a large institution, it's quite easy. And that's, in fact, the modus operandi. That's what they do, right? So they're so big that they say, well, we had no way of knowing, and you can't blame us for the whole action of the company, which is, this whole too big to jail thing. So ultimately, those things need to be broken up into pieces where you get accountability back into the equation. And so it's either by all means have due process, but have that actual due process that looks at who were the culprits, who were the directing minds. Don't let them hide behind a corporate veil. If you can prove that there was, a mens rea in the activities involved, or, awareness of the activities involved, direction, active and omissions. And then if they can't, then just break up the companies on the basis that these, organizations are criminal and are horrendous for everything that you want to have in a free and democratic society.
Yeah, they've gone rogue, and they need to be held accountable. And don't legalize the grand theft on a global scale, because when you do that, like you said, so just connect the dots now. So how did Trump arise from this exactly? How did we wind up with Donald J. Trump? Well, the storm.
He's just, he's the embodiment of populist ideas. He is someone who has no apparent moral code, who is, who is the opposite of transparency is Mr. Trump. He's been opaque from the very beginning, not revealing, not disclosing, not, all of this stuff. But even more broadly, just in terms of morality of the leader, it's hard to defend his morality. And Talib's book would argue that, ethics has always been different from laws. Laws come and go. Ethics should be consistent through time. So there's ethical standards, whether they're handed down through a biblical interpretation or whether they're just a code of behavior that's handed down through time. We all know what ethics should be, or what ideal ethics have been, suggested. And you get periods where people are breaking and breaching all the ethical principles. And in some cases, and they're saying, well, it's not illegal, or you can't prove it, or all this stuff. But ultimately, if you're an immoral leader and you have no ethical principles, you are not the face that we should be having of a democratic process or country. And that's so. I would say that Trump is the epitome of all this. But I would just, rather than get into whether someone loves or hates Donald Trump, I would say his character is the type of character that routinely comes out of these periods where you have this skew away from ethics, and conflicts of interest have become the platform policy of many of the institutions and regulations. And, as we've talked before, the sales function has become so dominant in driving policy decisions that there's really nothing else. And it goes back to the whole shareholder primacy theory. It goes back to our only responsibility as management is to make profits increase. Well, again, that in itself is a unethical, immoral, but also potentially very illegal statement, because there are consequences and fallout and things that are set in motion by actions. And if you're not responsible for any of that, we should consider that to be quite antisocial behavior, and indeed it's extremely costly for everyone else around you. And that's what we're seeing, the bankruptcy of the tax system, of you simply cannot have another thing from Talib's book is he says that only people who do should talk. And we have this whole category of people who are either academic or theorists of some kind who talk but don't actually do. This is something that I have in the work that I do, because I don't just talk about money management and protecting capital and how to safely grow savings over a lifetime. That's what I actually spend my day doing.
Right.
So it is I can, this back to, I am not in a huge bank. I'm in a small investment counsel company that has a relatively low number of people. And, there's no bullshit macro here because we have a direct relationship with our individual clients. So if we can't show them statements that say they've made X if they lose Y. They won't buy that. Yeah. Like the glossy brochures are not going to fudge over. As I once heard Peter Schiff on a radio call-in show telling someone who had lost 70% of their money that they hadn't actually lost because they were still collecting the dividends. Mm-hmm. And to this day, I will never forget that. So, it's just that kind of thing that people pull off when they're, at arm's length in some kind of a theoretical level and disconnected from the on-the-street real-life impacts of what their behavior or their recommendations are doing to people.
Yeah, accountability is really crucial, right? I mean, without accountability, what do we have? And I would just say that the corporation's primary purpose is to earn a profit for its shareholders, but to do so in a legally and ethically and morally
So in other words, you bought the Milton Friedman article that's the only preoccupation or goal, and I don't.
Well, the problem
I'm about the pre-Friedman article where corporations had many stakeholders: debtors, employers, banks. The environment that they worked in because they had to keep their resources renewing or at least in decent shape to be able to function, that all those stakeholders had an interest.
Well, I'm saying that its primary purpose is to earn a profit. And
no, but I'm saying you're saying that in meaning that's just since 1970 that's been a concept. So when you say that as if that's always been the case, it hasn't always been the case. That's what you're just sort of saying.
Economically, if a company doesn't earn a profit and they lose money for a protracted period of time, they will cease to exist. So in order to perpetuate the existence of the corporation, if you want corporations to lose money, have the government do it, because the government's the accommodating loser. They will always be happy.
But that's an extreme.
But
right?
that's what they do.
You don't have to have companies that are only run for profits, like increasing profits. I'm not talking about running companies at a loss, but I'm saying that if you're doing illegal maneuvers, gimmicks, off-balance sheet accounting, and all of the buybacks, all that to create the appearance of profitability or increasing profitability.
Wrong. That's wrong.
Meanwhile, you're sacrificing the company or the institution on a longer term basis because you're devastating the balance sheet in the process, or you're leaving a whole bunch of lawsuits which are going to come back and eat you alive.
Those are all unethical, immoral, and many times illegal practices.
Or just bad business decisions.
Yeah,
See, this is what I mean. They're bad business decisions in a longer than 3/4 view.
Of course. I mean, look, hey, you could seek to maximize the profit quarterly, which is something Trump talked about recently, eliminating quarterly reports, and that can easily be at the expense of your long-term viability and long-term profitability. So the first rule of survival of any organism, whether it's man-made or whether it's made by nature, is to survive. Okay? If the corporation doesn't survive, meaning it doesn't earn enough of a rate of return to reinvest and to ensure its long-term viability, then whatever else it wants to do is going to be pointless because it's not going to be able to do it. And the other thing is that corporations, just like people, have agendas, and their agenda, whether it's charitable or profit, whatever, isn't always admirable. So the point being that all these other causes that corporations get into, I don't think they should be involved in other causes, no matter how enviable, if they detract from its long-term profitability and viability. So, and of course, the whole thing is predicated on corporate governance acting ethically in the interest of its community, meaning we're not going to dump toxic waste into the river. All right, we're going to be as mindful of the environment as is humanly possible. We're not going to steal from either our employees, our customers, our lenders, or our shareholders. That's a given. So I think it's...
Except that's been a main business model.
But that's not, it doesn't make it right. We both agree on that. It shouldn't be.
Absolutely.
It's
absolutely.
totally, and it's why we are where we are today. Like the whole mortgage crisis would have never happened if businesses, didn't just look to maximize the next quarter and, the FDA, the FHA, Fannie, Freddie, be damned. It wouldn't have happened. So I think it's very consistent.
Misplaced incentives for sure on the actors involved, and also lack of accountability and lack of prosecution.
Absolutely.
So, that's the whole thing. If there's no individual ethics, and apparently we're in a bear market in ethics.
Yeah, I think we're in a downright depression when it comes to ethics, Danielle.
So luckily, these things too seem to be cyclical, and ultimately. Because the ethics didn't go away. We all know most people know what good ethics are.
Yeah, of course.
It's just we've allowed ourselves to have all these commingling of, gray lines instead of saying, no, that's clearly should be illegal. If it's not illegal, it's definitely unethical and it's definitely destructive.
Moral relativism is really the downfall of humanity, because ethics is what happens when nobody's watching and you've got the pot of gold there that isn't yours and you could take it or see to it that the rightful owner's interests are protected. And that's really what it's about. So profit.
Let's just connect this to a broader theme, which I think is extremely important and very important to your listeners, which is this whole idea of just because, like saying that, for example, all a corporation has to do is make, grow profits as its sole mandate is the same thing as confusing speculating with investing, for example. So as I said, they may have a short-term focus on quarterly earnings at the expense of the long-term viability of the company itself. And then it's not there to serve anyone's interests after a few years. And indeed, we're seeing that with the longevity shrinking and shrinking and shrinking of companies.
Absolutely.
Because they're being literally, recklessly driven into the ground by extractors who take money up front and aren't really concerned about longevity or lasting anything. So you've got that, but also when it comes to the idea of who's an investor in these things, there used to be, or at different times, there's been a clear division between the notion of speculation and the notion of investment. And I would say that this is similar to the corporate mentality of profits, profits, profits at all costs. In other words, if you're buying something because you think it might go up further and you're not concerned about whether it's going to be a long-standing, business or asset that will have intrinsic value or pay you an income over time that will be worth, the parting of your immediate capital to get that stream of income. If you're not doing any of that, then you're speculating. And yet what's happened is because we have a whole media and franchise of finance around the concept of anything that you're putting money into is now called investing.
Yeah.
So whether it's, whether it's a startup, which has a 85% chance of going bankrupt in the first 5 years, or whether it's a, legitimate business model that's, responsibly being managed, they're all kind of thrown into one pot right now. And that's where I think a lot of risk comes in, because people, for example, may buy cryptocurrencies thinking they're investing, not realizing that's a blind speculation. And yes, it might work out, but it's still not investment grade in any way. And the same thing goes with the pot craze right now. It's not that there's no, that the long-term prospects of that sector are not likely to have some strong winners, but with all the uncertainty and startups left and right, this is the very nature of speculation as well. So it's only dangerous when people don't define one from the other, because then they start, like very few people would go to the casino with most of their life savings or a lot of their life savings because they go, well, it's the casino, that'd be crazy. But they don't realize that they're doing the same thing.
Yes.
Under the guise of investing in these financial markets that are driven by these very reckless players and managers.
Very true. And I go back to Benjamin Graham. I'm looking up, but of course my computer's going terribly slowly because we're doing video and audio, and it's time for a new one. But I'm waiting for Apple to finally get their act together. So, investing is all about figuring out the margin of error and the rate of return. Okay, here's the difference. What is the difference between speculation and investing? And, Benjamin Graham had the best, I think he had the best one, said an investment operation is one which, upon thorough analysis, promises safety of principal and a satisfactory return. Operations not meeting these requirements are speculative. I think that really kind of sums it up, doesn't it?
Well, you see, that's what he wrote in 1934 in Security Analysis, but he revisited it later in 49 in The Intelligent Investor. And he says just basically what I just said, that, that was my definition. But the problem becomes, he says, in the easy language of Wall Street, everyone who buys or sells a security has suddenly become an investor, regardless of what he buys or for what purpose or at what price or whether for cash or whether on margin. And so he says that is the problem, because people now are, throwing the good in with the bad, the speculative in with the steady, and, comparing. And so it's like saying, well, we ran faster than you, but they're not even in the same race. So if your focus is on protecting your principal and not taking reckless risks, which is what we do here for our clients and ourselves, you're being compared against people who are doing the most insane, reckless things, who ultimately they will go bust and fall on their own sword. But in the meantime, people are saying, well, we're beating you. Well, we're beating you,
It sure feels good while it's going up, but it doesn't go up forever. And when it goes down, and it can go down violently, we've seen it in the past, then all of a sudden, the rationale of the street is always, it'll come back. It always comes back. And it's all timing. If only I had sold before it went down, everything would be fine. I'd be buying back at higher prices. We saw it with Bitcoin. I mean, December 15th was the peak. I wrote my article that you should at least sell half of your cryptocurrency holdings on the 16th, not knowing that was the peak, but knowing that the peak was imminent. And, that came out on the 17th. So the peak was December 15th, and it was obvious it was coming. You just had to look at the chart. We had numerous discussions about this phenomena, Danielle, you and I, and we were right. So eventually, unfortunately, the same is going to happen to the broader market, and there's really nothing we could do about it. It's just a question of when.
The microcosm of, whether it's cryptocurrency, whether it's the pot stocks, which I was just at the Toronto Money Show and everyone's running around, picking up which brochure is going to be the big winner and the pot stocks. And the thing is, they forget all the principles about how much of their life savings should be put into the speculative pursuit, right? And they're thinking that they're doing something savvy or smart or investing. They don't think of it as gambling. And that's why it can be so devastating. And then you're within a market climate where free money was handed out, where chips were given out by central banks to all the most reckless players so that they could, play away. And that's why we're in the predicament we are. So it's really that flow of capital has really fudged the lines for people, again, between reckless pursuits and prudent pursuits with capital. And it's happened on a micro, individual sectors and fund flows, and it's happened on a macro in terms of the whole global economy. So it's been quite a contagion.
Well, the pot stocks are proof that money does grow on trees. Unfortunately, if you study this market, you understand it's a commodity. Yes, alcohol is a commodity. You could buy your $5 a liter vodka at Costco, their house brand, which isn't half bad, or you could buy $35 a liter Grey Goose or Tito's. And the fact is that what's happening now in states where it's been legalized for a while, at least in Oregon and Washington State, as prices are down 50% from where they were a year ago. And if that isn't an alarm bell to anyone who's considering, but, it reminds me of the casino stocks. When casino gambling was limited to just Vegas and Atlantic City came afterwards, and then an Indian casino here or there, you couldn't lose money at it. You just couldn't, because demand far outstripped supply. Didn't matter how good your brand was or your supply was, you couldn't lose money in casino gambling.
Well, because your patrons were always losing money, right?
Yeah, well, of course. Of course. They don't build those places for winners, as my parents used to say. But then when it became all over the place, all of a sudden Atlantic City fell to hell. Vegas had to reposition itself. They really got hit by the financial crash. But all of a sudden, you had way more supply than you had demand. And there are plenty of casinos in this world now, Danielle, in the U.S. and north of the border, that are barely holding on, that the places are dumps, and there's been no investment in the physical plant, and they're going to go down the tubes. This is exactly what is going to happen in the cannabis business. But if you find the right cannabis stock, if you're smart enough or lucky enough to find the Google of cannabis or the Facebook of cannabis or whatever, I was going to say the Tesla of cannabis, but probably a bad joke there. If you're lucky enough to find it, you'll ride the wave and maybe you'll get wealthy on it, but more than likely not.
For however long the market cycle goes. And then, this is the other thing I was saying in my talk in Toronto on the weekend, is it's one thing to sort of pick your wave and say, I want to try and bet in this, and maybe you will be successful, but it also has to line up with the capital waves that are going through financial markets. So, Apple and Amazon still crashed 70 and 80%, even though they would go on to be the defining, tech companies of the last decade. In the crash of 2002-03 and in 07-08, that's the kind of value they lost. So as long as people are aware that the capital flows they're on are bigger than themselves.
Need a risk calculator, some type of financial risk calculator. Anybody can put their portfolio in there. I know that risk is a little bit subjective. Anyways, we're about done, but I'm glad we spent the time talking. If you hadn't been around for a bit, entirely due to my fault. It's always great having you on, Danielle. Make sure you go over to jugglingdynamite.com, read those articles, especially the one of how we got Trump, and the other one of, mass fraud and lack of prosecution have enabled ongoing financial crime epidemic. Maybe one day we will live in a world more just and the guilty parties will be held accountable. But until then, it's buyer beware, and you need to beware. Send us an email, questions, comments, kl@kerrylutz.com. Danielle, always great to talk to you. We'll catch you in a couple weeks.
Thanks, Kerry.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.